Okay, this is where we were at the end of our last class. We were looking at the factors that cause a change in demand. Now let's make sure we remember this. A change in quantity demanded is brought about by what? What causes a change in quantity demanded? Somebody. There's only one thing that causes it. A change in the price of the item. On the other hand, if your purchase of something changes for some other reason, well, that is described as a change in your demand as opposed to quantity demanded. Right? So what did we learn in class last time? We've learned that a change in demand is a shift of the entire demand curve as opposed to a change in quantity demanded, which is a movement along a given demand curve. Do you remember that? So for instance, in this diagram here, a move from point B to point C, well, that is a change in quantity demanded, brought about by a change in the price of the item. Okay? So we were looking at the various other factors then that cause a change in demand, cause the entire demand curve to shift. And we had studied the first one, which is the changes in the prices of other related goods. And when we speak of relationships, we learnt in class last time that there are two kinds of relationships, one of substitutability and the other one of complementarity. Right? Now, when the price of a substitute rises, what happens to the demand for the good in question? So let's say that we're looking at the demand for beef, right? And let's say people consider pork to be a substitute. Yes? So this here, with this curve here, with the demand curve for beef, and let's say that this here is the quantity then of beef, and that's the price of beef, okay? And the price of pork rises. Now the price of pork, of course, is not measured in this diagram. Correct? The price of pork is behind the scenes. But a rise in the price of pork would cause what to happen to this diagram here? The demand curve for beef. Assuming that you consider pork and beef to be substitutes. Come on, I need some quick thinking here. I know you're a little slow this morning, but perk up, okay? Now, what's going to happen to the demand curve for beef if the price of pork were to rise? Fall, you say? Well, hang on. If the price of pork rises, wouldn't people make a switch from pork to beef? And so the demand for beef would increase. How would you depict that? How would you show that in this diagram? Would that be a movement from, let's say, point A to point B or something? It is going to go rightward, exactly. It wouldn't be a movement along this curve at all, because a movement along this curve is brought about by a change in the price of beef. The price of beef hasn't changed. It's the price of pork that has. Correct? So this entire curve then basically shifts to the right like that, meaning at the same price of beef as before, people buy more beef. This is a rightward shift of the entire demand curve. Right? On the other hand, if pork prices fell, there would be a switch into pork, out of beef, and that would be a leftward shift in this demand curve of beef. Understood? Next point. Expected future prices. If people expect future prices of beef to be, let's say, higher, if people have an idea that HEB is going to be raising beef prices next week, what do you think will happen to people's demand for beef this week? This week, the prices haven't changed, still the same old price, but we have some intimation that prices are going to be higher next week. People will stock up on beef this week, is that correct? So their demand curve for beef this week shall shift to the right, correct? On the other hand, if people expect beef prices to be lower next week, then they may postpone buying beef. So their demand this week would fall. There would be a leftward shift in this week's demand curve. Right? Next, income. What if your income rises? What happens to demand for the good in question if your income rises? Would your demand go up? Not necessarily. It depends on the nature of the good. If the good is a normal good, then your demand for it would rise. On the other hand, there are some goods that are called inferior goods. And your demand for inferior goods falls when your income rises. An example of an inferior good would be McDonald's burgers, let's say. The more income you have, the more likely you are to go to fancy restaurants as opposed to fast food places. Agreed? So there are many goods out there that are actually inferior. Right? The more income you have, the less you buy of these goods. Okay? So that all depends on the nature of the good. If the good is inferior and your income rises, in which direction shall your demand curve for the good shift? Come on, quick. Your income rises. What happens to your demand for an inferior good? Decreases. We have a leftward shift in the demand curve for an inferior good with a rise in income. Correct? Next, expected future income and credit. Now, if people have an expectation that their income shall go up in the future, they may already start to behave as if their income today has gone up. Is that correct? If you expect a rise at work next month, you may already begin to think you have more income, and you may consequently increase your demand for normal goods. Right? In the same way, if you have an expectation that your credit limits are going to rise next week, if you anticipate that you're getting a new credit card in the mail, let's say, you may already start to behave as if you have more credit. You follow me? So expectations of future income and credit also then influences demand for goods. Next, the number of buyers. Now, the number of buyers would clearly impact market demand. Why is that? Because remember, market demand is arrived at by adding up individual consumers' demand curves sideways. So the more individuals there are, the more demand curves you have to add up sideways. And so you would end up with a market demand curve that is further to the right, because you've added up more of these horizontal distances. Do you understand? So the more consumers there are, the greater is market demand for a good likely to be. Correct? For example, with SpaceX coming to Brownsville and UTRGV and so on, what do you expect to happen to demand for housing in Brownsville in the near future? You expect it to rise. And why is that? Because there will be more consumers in this market, consumers of housing, that is. Correct? Lastly, tastes and preferences. Right? If a consumer enjoys a good more than he used to, that's when his demand for that good is going to increase. So if I go on an Atkins diet, a high-protein Atkins diet, I may increase my demand for beef, even though the price of beef hasn't changed, correct? My entire demand curve for beef would shift rightward if I begin to fancy a high-protein diet. Is that correct? So tastes and preferences would act that way. If you read an article in the newspaper or something, an influential article saying that eating something is good for you, your demand for that item may increase. On the other hand, if you read that something is bad for you, your demand for that item may decrease. Right? So that's how tastes and preferences work. Right? Now this slide is something that is exceedingly important, and you should perhaps keep a copy of this slide handy. Okay? We've already discussed this. A change in quantity demanded results in a movement along a given demand curve. So you basically slide either up or down a given demand curve, let's say from point A to point B. That's a change in quantity demanded. On the other hand, a change in demand is a shift of the entire demand curve. So we are talking a movement from A to B like that. Yes? And that sort of summarizes this very important distinction between quantity demanded and demand. Next, we move now to supply, which is the other side of our story. Now, when you're talking about supply, who are the agents we are talking about now? You see, when you talk about demand, when you speak of demand, your agents are consumers. Is that correct? But when you speak of supply, your agents are going to be producers, firms. Is that right? So your agents here are firms or businesses. So we are now going to be looking at the behavior of businesses, right? So we have a law of supply, just as we have a law of demand, we have a law of supply. And the law of supply states that other things remaining the same, and do you remember the Latin phrase for this? Ceteris paribus. I believe it is ceteris and not ceteris, but I could be wrong. Okay? Ceteris paribus. Other things remaining the same. In other words, controlling for all other influences. Other than what? Other than the price of the good itself. That's what we mean by other. So keeping all these other influences constant, if the price of a good rises, the quantity supplied increases. Does that make sense to you? If the price of a good rises, firms find it profitable to produce more of it. Why do you think this happens? What lies behind the simple fact that the higher the price, the greater the quantity supplied by businesses? Yes, there'll be more profit to be made with a higher price. There'll be more money to be made. Correct? So it's the profit motive of businesses that causes them to increase their quantity supplied with a rise in the goods price. Now, there's something to be remembered here. In order for this to make sense, in order to say that price affects quantity supplied, in order to say that, you have to assume that this is not controlled by firms. Otherwise, the statement would make no sense. We have to assume that price is not controlled by firms. Otherwise, you see, if the firm controlled the price, and we know, of course, the firm controls its production, its quantity supplied, then you really couldn't speak of price causing a change in quantity supplied because the firm is controlling both. Am I making sense? Right? Consider this example. Let's say that you have my hands here, right? I control the movement of both, correct? If I raise my right hand and at the same time raise my left hand, could I say that it's the rise of my right hand that is causing the rise in my left hand? Could I say that? You see what I'm saying? Is the rise in my right hand causing the rise in my left hand? Is there a connection between those two hands? Not really. I am controlling both. Do you understand? So in order for one to speak of something affecting something else, the two things have to be really independent of each other. Am I correct? So therefore, what underlies this, what underlies the law of supply is that the firm does not control the price of the good. Now, is there a situation where you can think of where a producer does not control the price? Well, let's consider a farmer down here in the valley, a farmer who grows, let's say, soybeans. Does this farmer control the price of soybeans? Does he? Clearly no, because he's such a small drop in this ocean of soybeans. He doesn't control the price of soybeans at all. He gets the price of soybeans from USDA or something. And he then decides how much soybeans to plant on his land, to sow on his land. He makes the production decision. But the price is something that he doesn't control. Agreed? Right? So agricultural markets are a good example of this, where the producer does not control the price. The producer simply reacts to the price. Right? If the price of wheat were to rise, Farmer Joe down here in the valley may decide to grow more wheat, increase his quantity supplied of wheat. But he doesn't control the price of wheat. Right? So that's what we're talking about here. And this kind of a market, by the way, is called a perfectly competitive market. So one of the characteristics of a perfectly competitive market is that the firm is a price taker. That's how you describe the firm. The firm is a price taker. The firm does not control the price. Okay? All right, so coming back to the law of supply, so it says here that there is this positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. If the price falls, the firm finds it profitable to decrease its quantity supply because there'd be less money to be made producing the good. Right? We can now speak of a supply schedule and a supply curve. Here we have a supply schedule. Again, the good in question is bottled water, as before. But now we're talking about a firm that produces bottled water. Right? And it says here that at a price of 50 cents a bottle, this firm finds it profitable to produce no water. The price is too low for the firm to even produce one bottle of water. If the price were to rise to $1 a bottle, this firm now finds it profitable to produce 1,000 bottles per day. Right? If the price were to further rise to $1.50, this firm finds it profitable to produce 2,000 bottles a day. And if the price were to rise to $2 a bottle, then the firm would find it profitable to produce 3,000 bottles a day. Now these points A, B, C, D can be plotted on a graph as shown in the diagram to the right. And this gives us a supply curve. Now again, it is coincidental that the supply curve shown here is a straight line. There is no reason for a supply curve to be a straight line. This is a straight line supply curve for the purposes of simplicity. A supply curve could be like this, or like that, or even squiggly. Okay? But in this case, we have a straight line supply curve. Right? So what information do we get from this supply curve? What information does this supply curve tell us? Well, for any price, we can pretty much predict the quantity of bottled water that this firm would produce. For any price, we could do that. For that price, we could similarly read off or predict the quantity that would be supplied. So that is the information contained in a supply curve. Right? Now, if the price of bottled water rises from $1 to $1.50, this would cause the firm's production of bottled water to rise from 1,000 bottles to 2,000 bottles, correct? Now this increase in the firm's production, would you call this a change in supply or quantity supplied? Quantity supplied. Quantity supplied, why? Because it is being caused by a rise in the price. So a change in quantity supplied is only brought about by what? A change in the goods price. right? And you can see here that a change in quantity supplied is pretty much a movement along a given supply curve, for instance, from point C to point B, right? Okay, now for market supply. Market supply, like market demand, is simply the sum of the supply curves of all the individual firms in the market, just as market demand is the sum of all the individual demand curves, correct? And how do you add up supply curves? It says here, the market supply curve is the horizontal sum or lateral sum of individual firms' supply curves. And how is this lateral sum done? In pretty much the same way that we added up demand curves, you see. Here we have two supply curves. This is firm Agua, and this is firm Prima. These are two businesses that produce bottled water. And these are their supply curves. So how do you add up their supply curves to arrive at their combined supply curve? You add up these curves sideways, correct? For instance, at a price of $1, Agua decides to produce 1,000 bottles a day, right? Whereas Prima supplies 2,000 bottles a day, which gives us a total of 3,000 bottles a day. So how are we adding these curves up? We're adding them up sideways in the sense that this sideways distance plus that sideways distance gives us that sideways distance. So we're adding up these curves sideways. And we're doing this for two suppliers, but we could just as easily do this for 1 million firms. Correct? So this is how one arrives at market supply. Now, what information is contained in a market supply curve? Well, for any price, we will be able to do what? We will be able to predict the total quantity supplied by all the firms in this market. That is the information contained in a market supply curve. And now we come to supply as opposed to quantity supplied. So now we come to supply. Now a change in supply. A change in supply is caused by what? What is a change in supply caused by, as opposed to a change in quantity supplied? This would be caused by changes in other factors. Other than what, that is? Other than price. Other than the price of the good itself, that is. Now, there could be other prices involved, prices of other goods. That's fine. But other than the price of this good, the good in question. Right? Now, what does a change in supply entail? It says here, a change in supply means there is a new supply schedule and a new supply curve. Right? And what's the idea here? It's, now, given that you know that demand curves shift when there is a change in demand, this won't be difficult to understand at all. It's pretty much the same idea. At a price of, let's say, $1.50, this firm used to, or firms in this market, assuming this is market supply, used to produce so many million bottles of water. Let's call it Q1. Okay, let's say this is where we are to begin with. And now you have drought. And this drought dries up many natural springs from which these water companies get their water. Right? So now what is going to happen to the market supply curve for bottled water? What will happen? Well, at that same price of $1.50 a bottle, instead of producing Q1, instead of supplying quantity Q1, because of this drying up of this resource, the raw material, which is the spring water, I would expect firms in this market to produce less water than before, a quantity Q1 prime, prime being the apostrophe. You see, so instead of this being point A being the quantity supply dash price combination, point B should become the new quantity supply price combination. And point B doesn't lie out there in space. We say that point B lies on a whole new supply curve, one that is to the left of the original supply curve. So the entire supply curve shifts from S0 to S1. Now remember that even though these are curves that are like this, you are not to view them as a shift in this direction. This is the wrong way to view it. You have to view this as a shift to the left, not upward. Why not upward? Because you see our quantity axis is the horizontal axis. So when we think of a firm reducing its output of water, output measured in number of bottles, you would have to think of the horizontal axis, because that's the axis that measures this. Am I making sense? The vertical axis, on the other hand, measures price. So this shift is not a vertical shift, it's a horizontal shift. Okay? So that's a decrease in supply. On the other hand, something could happen that causes these springs, these natural springs to become even more productive, more abundant or something. And that might cause the opposite to happen. The supply curve would shift rightward. If there was a lot of rainfall and all these natural springs began to produce more water than before. Right? So now we are going to look at the factors that cause factors causing a change in supply, meaning a shift of the supply curve. And here is the list. This slide is as important as the other slide that showed us the factors causing a change in demand. So these are two key slides here in this chapter. Okay? So we start with the prices of related goods. And remember, this was a factor in the other slide as well. Right? Now there, when we were talking about demand, what types of related goods were we talking about? What were the two kinds of related goods we were talking about? Substitutes and complements. Well, we have substitutes and complements here as well, but in this case, we are going to have substitutes and complements in production. In production, not consumption. Do you follow what I'm saying? Because this is to be viewed as, or viewed from the point of view of the firm. So in the other example, we spoke of beef and pork being substitutes, but they were substitutes in consumption. Here we're going to talk of goods that are substitutes in production. So let's say we have a farmer. And this farmer on his land can grow wheat, or he can grow cotton. He has a limited amount of land, of course. Land is a scarce resource for him. Now, let's say that wheat is our good in question. So that's the supply that we are interested in. And let's say the price of cotton rises. So the price of cotton rises. What do you think will happen to this farmer's wheat production? Fall, because he would rather now grow more cotton on his land. Cotton prices having gone up. Correct? So if the price of a good that is a substitute in production rises, you expect the supply of the good in question to to not rise, but fall. The farmer grows less wheat when the price of cotton rises. Correct? So in terms of our supply curve, what happens here? If I were to draw a little supply curve here of wheat, this is the supply of wheat, what would happen to the supply curve? Shift to the left, precisely. It would shift to the left. There would be a decrease in the supply of wheat with a rise in the price of cotton. Correct? On the other hand, if cotton prices fell, the opposite would happen. The farmer would decide to grow more wheat instead of cotton. What about complements? Complements in production. Now, what were complements in consumption? Goods that were consumed together like cars and gasoline. Correct? But now we are talking about complementarity from the viewpoint of production. So now we basically mean jointly produced goods. So we mean jointly produced goods. Goods that are jointly produced. Can you give me an example of jointly produced goods? Meaning you produce one thing, but at the same time you're producing something else. Any ideas? Someone. Would you say that beef and leather are jointly produced goods? Correct? Can you think of another example? I'll give you a historical example. You see, just the other day we were talking about how sugar was very expensive in a few hundred years ago. Correct? Until the British came to the Caribbean and began to grow sugarcane there using slave labor. Can you give me a byproduct of sugar? That was all. Molasses is actually a raw material that goes into the making of sugar. Something that came out of those plantations, something other than sugar. That was also very valuable. Well, I'm glad it doesn't come to mind. It shows me that you're all, presumably many of you are younger than 21. And so it's a good thing you don't know these things, but the word is yes. That came out of these plantations as well. See? All the organic material that was left over from sugar production, well, all of that was converted into, was fermented, etc., and distilled into rum. Okay? Jamaican rum, famous still, correct? Now, that's an example of a jointly produced good. Now, what would happen, do you think, to the supply of beef if the price of leather went up? What would happen to the supply of beef if the price of leather went up? Remember, the two goods are produced together. It's going to go up, exactly. Because, you see, you produce leather along with beef. If leather prices go up, you'd like to produce more leather, but the only way you can do that is by producing more beef. And so your supply of beef would then rise. Yes? Which would be a rightward shift in your supply curve of beef. Next, prices of resources and other inputs. It says here, a rise in the price of a raw material shall cause supply of the good in question to fall. A good example here would be the price of fertilizer for a farmer. Fertilizer is an important raw material for a farmer. Now, if fertilizer became more expensive, the farmer would naturally use less of it. And if he used less of it, what would happen to his crop yields? They would fall. He would grow less of any crop per acre. Right? And so what happens to his supply of, let's say, wheat? Falls. Supply curve shifts to the left. So a rise in the price of raw materials causes a decrease in supply. Let me give you another example. What would happen to the supply of orange juice if there was a drought in Florida that killed off a lot of orange trees? What would happen to the supply of orange juice if that happened? Now think, oranges, orange juice. Oranges are a raw material in the making of orange juice. Right? Now, you expect, because of this drought, you expect the price of oranges to rise. And that will become clearer as we proceed in this chapter. But as supply decreases, the price of oranges would rise. A higher price of oranges would cause the supply of orange juice to decrease, because we've learned here that the higher the price of a raw material, the lower the supply of the good in question. Correct? Expected future prices. Now, this is something that featured in the other slide as well. If firms expect a rise in future prices, what will happen to their current supply? Assuming the good is one that can be stored, that this is not a perishable good. Assuming this is not a perishable good, what would happen to the supply of this good? If an oil company thinks that crude oil prices are going to go up next week, what would happen to their supply this week? Fall. They would rather wait and sell next week, you see. So today's supply would decrease. On the other hand, if they expect oil prices to fall next week, they would try to sell as much as possible this week. So their supply this week would rise. Number of sellers. Now this, of course, affects market supply. The more sellers there are in the market, the more to the right the market supply becomes, because you're adding up more of those horizontal distances. Correct? Lastly, productivity. A rise in productivity brought about, for example, by technological change shall cause an increase in supply. An example here would be, let's say that a better fertilizer, were invented. Let's say scientists invent a super fertilizer. Now the use of this fertilizer would do what to a farmer's yields? Raise it, and so the farmer's supply of, let's say, wheat would increase. Right? So improvements in technology can cause increases in supply. So these are the factors that cause the supply curve to shift. Okay? So once again, to summarize, a change in quantity supplied is brought about by a change in the price, and that alone. And this can be viewed as a movement along a given supply curve from, let's say, point A to point B. A change in supply, on the other hand, is brought about by a change in other factors. And the other factors are listed in the slide we just saw. Price of raw materials, improvements in technology, etc. Those are the factors, right? And that causes a change in supply, and this has to be viewed as a movement from A to B, where point B lies on a whole new supply curve. And now we come to market equilibrium. So here we are going to answer the question, how are prices determined? How are prices determined in competitive markets? And we need this idea of market equilibrium. So it says here, market equilibrium occurs when the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. In other words, quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. That's our condition for market equilibrium. It says here, equilibrium price is the price at which quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. And equilibrium quantity is the quantity bought and sold at the equilibrium price. So in other words, QD equals QS equals Q equilibrium. The equilibrium is typically written as with a star superscript. You see, so that's our equilibrium quantity. Now this is going to become clearer with the following diagram. So what do we have here in this diagram? We have market demand and we have market supply, and we draw them in the same diagram. Market demand, of course, is a negatively sloped curve, given the law of demand, which states that there is a negative relationship between price and quantity demanded. Market supply, on the other hand, is positively sloped, given the law of supply, which states that there is a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. Okay? Now, in order to fully understand this diagram, let's start with a price of $1.50 per bottle. At a price of $1.50, what would be market quantity demanded? Well, we would have to read that off the, which curve? The market demand curve, correct? So we would go there and then go vertically down like this, and we arrive at 9 million bottles a day. On the other hand, the quantity supplied at that price shall be how much? That you will have to read off the market supply curve. 11 million bottles a day. So this gap here between these two curves, this horizontal distance between them is how much? Represents what? Well, that represents surplus water in this market. The fact that producers have produced more water than consumers want. And what is that surplus water equal to in this case? 2 million bottles. Is that right? 11 million minus 9 million. So that horizontal distance indicates that there is surplus water in this market. Now, surplus water is something that is basically something that firms are stuck with. Firms of all this unsold water. Correct? Now, firms don't like to have unsold goods because storing these goods is expensive. You need to warehouse these goods and so on. You know, no firm wants to have stockpiles of unsold goods. So what do you think is going to happen in this setup then? Firms will try to sell their unsold stock. And how will they attract customers? What is the typical way in which firms attract customers? By having a sale, correct? By lowering price. Each firm will try to steal the other firm's customers by lowering price. But remember, this is a competitive market, so the moment one firm lowers price, all the other firms follow suit. And there will then be this price war between firms. And this price war will drive down the price. And let's say that very quickly the price falls to $1.25. Now at $1.25, what happens? Well, at that new price, there will be, of course, a new quantity demanded and a new quantity supplied. But the point is, you still have a horizontal distance between the two curves. In other words, you still have a surplus. All right, so we started out with a price of $1.50 per bottle. Price by tomorrow, the price fell to $1.25, but at that price of $1.25, you still had firms' quantity supplied exceeding consumers' quantity demanded. You still have a surplus. And as long as there is a surplus, firms will continue to engage in competition with each other. Firms will continue to try to steal each other's customers, and this will continue to drive down the price. And the price will fall until it hits $1, because once it hits $1, you notice there is no longer a horizontal distance, a horizontal gap between the two curves. In other words, at a price of $1, what's true? What's true at this point? quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. In other words, there is no surplus, and so there is no further incentive for firms to engage in competition with each other, further driving down the price. Correct? So the price simply stops at $1, which then is called the equilibrium price, P star. And the equilibrium quantity happens to be Q star, which is both quantity demanded and quantity supplied. So this is how a market quickly comes to equilibrium. Right? And we will stop here today.